It's the autumn of 1505. The beaches of Sri Lanka are burning. Portuguese soldiers are storming the island. The violent chaos that follows will last for the next 300 years. Villages will be destroyed, and the native people will be enslaved. And it wasn't going to stop with the Portuguese. Years later, the Dutch East India Company would arrive to torture anyone who dared to question its corporate ambition. What was the prize that was worth centuries of colonial bloodshed? Diamond mines? A cure for the plague? No, it was for the dry brown powder you sprinkle on your cappuccino. This is the story of how the world went mad for tree bark. It's a story of giant mythical birds and dead Roman emperors, and a global economy based on the idea that a tree getting a shave is worth more than gold. For 2,000 years, the Western world knew two things about cinnamon. They wanted it, and the only way to get it was terrifying. The Greek historian Herodotus lived in the 5th century BCE. He was never much troubled by fact-checking and didn't think that cinnamon was grown in the ground. Instead, he wrote that it was harvested from the nests of the cynomologus, nightmarish giant birds that build their nests on cliffs in Arabia. And what were their nests made of? Cinnamon sticks. It seems nobody thought to ask why a monster bird would build its nest out of cooking ingredients. Arab traders, somehow managing to keep a straight face, explained to the easily fooled Greeks that they couldn't just climb up and grab the loot. That would risk being eaten by the giant birds. They claimed they had developed a genius, if slightly bonkers, method for collecting the cinnamon. They would butcher farm animals, cut them into massive pieces, and leave them at the base of the cliffs. The giant birds were greedy, but really bad at physics. They would fly down, grab the meat, and carry it back to their nests. But these monster birds were not the sharpest tools in the shed. They would fail to work out that their nests weren't designed to hold the weight of a dead donkey. With a crash, the nests would collapse under the weight. Showers of precious cinnamon sticks would fall to the ground, where the traders would hurriedly collect them before the birds realized they'd been duped. It sounds like something you'd tell a toddler to get them to eat their vegetables. But the ancient world bought it. Why? Because it cost a fortune. And things that cost a fortune must surely be true. In 65 AD, the Roman Emperor Nero killed his wife Poppaea. In a fit of guilt, or perhaps just to show everyone how rich he was, he ordered the burning of a year's supply of Rome's cinnamon at her funeral. Not just a bonfire, it was like burning the central bank of a small country to show how terribly sorry he was. The Arab traders had pulled off the greatest marketing scam in history. By inventing monsters, they turned the bark of a common tree into a priceless resource. But tall tales have a shelf life, and the sell-by date was fast approaching. So why were we paying such a fortune for dried bark? It wasn't because we were desperate to make better apple crumbles. For most of history, cinnamon wasn't so much a food as a bridge between men and gods. In ancient Egypt, nobody was sprinkling cinnamon on their morning porridge. They were stuffing it into the hollowed-out bodies of dead pharaohs. It was a key ingredient in preparing bodies for burial, a way to mask the scent of death with something that smelled like eternal life. If you were wealthy enough to be mummified with high-grade cinnamon, you weren't just dead, you were posh and dead. It was much the same in the Bible. The book of Exodus lists cinnamon as a must-have ingredient in holy oil. It was a sacred substance reserved for the most sacred of rituals. But by the time we get to medieval Europe, the obsession had shifted from the altar to the dining table. European elites believed in the medical theory of the four humours, which said that the human body was naturally cold and wet. It therefore needed hot and dry foods to stop it from decaying into a puddle of sadness. Cinnamon was one of those foods, and medieval lords would carpet bomb their savoury dishes with it. A stew wasn't finished until it tasted like a Christmas candle. Serving a dish heavy with cinnamon was, in the 14th century, like parking a Lamborghini in your dining room. Rather showy if you ask me. It was mainly used to flavour roast boar, venison and pheasant. Today, a spice once used to perfume the corpses of kings is almost only used for sugary buns and dusting the froth on your Starbucks. Ironic, isn't it? We went from spicing the roast beast to dusting the donut. But there's a scientific reason for this obsession too. The chemical that gives cinnamon its aroma is called cinnamaldehyde. When it hits your tongue, it doesn't actually trigger a taste, it triggers a physical reaction. It activates the same sensors that detect cold temperatures and pain. It's a kind of food-related abuse addiction. We love cinnamon because it hurts us. It creates a fake sensation of warmth by irritating our mouths. By the late 15th century, Europe was hooked on this pain. Demand was sky high, the price was ridiculous, and the Arab monopoly was bleeding treasuries dry. The European nobility realized they couldn't keep paying the middleman. They needed a direct line to the source. They needed to find where the giant birds lived. And in 1505, a Portuguese fleet was blown off course and accidentally found the answer. In November 1505, a Portuguese captain named Lourenço de Almeida was busy doing what European explorers did best, getting hopelessly lost. He was trying to catch Arab ships near the Maldives. Instead, a storm blew his fleet eastward, dumping him on the shores of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. When the Portuguese sailors stepped onto the sand, they didn't find giant cliffs. They didn't find flesh-eating birds or dragons guarding a sacred garden. They found trees, acres and acres of Cinnamomum verum trees growing wild in the forests, as common as weeds. The great secret of the ancient world was revealed. There was no magic. Cinnamon was just a farm product. And were the Portuguese delighted to find the source of the world's most expensive spice growing in the wild? If they were, the excitement quickly turned ugly. The Estado da India, the Portuguese Empire's regional branch office, was not a trading company in the polite sense. It was a military organization that occasionally sold pepper. Realizing they had stumbled on the source, they didn't offer to buy the land. They marched to the King of Cotta and demanded a payment of £25,000 of cinnamon bark a year for the benefit of not being shot at. This was the beginning of what's called the Cinnamon War, although it was less of a war and more of an occupation. The Portuguese quickly turned the harvest into a production line, forcing the island's traditional cinnamon peelers into work. We should pause here to appreciate that peeling cinnamon is not like picking apples. It's surgical. The cinnamon tree is cut down to a stump, forcing it to shoot up long, straight, whip-like branches. The peeler harvests those shoots while the sap is rising, scraping off the rough outer bark. The inner layer of bark is then rubbed with a brass rod to loosen it, before being sliced and peeled off in long strips. This is where the magic happens. Because the inner side dries faster than the outer side, the cinnamon strip naturally curls in on itself, forming the tight tube shape that you recognize in a jar. It's delicate, skilled work, and the Portuguese managed it with the grace of a sledgehammer. They took the families of the peelers hostage to ensure targets were met. If a village failed to deliver the required weight of bark, the punishment was brutal. For over 100 years, the Portuguese held the island in a stranglehold. They had the guns and a monopoly over the spice. But they made a classic mistake. They assumed they were the biggest fish in the sea. In the murky waters of the 17th century spice trade, there was a bigger, hungrier fish, and this one spoke Dutch. In 1638, the King of Cotta made a decision he'd later regret. Desperate to get rid of the Portuguese, he asked the Dutch for assistance. The Dutch East India Company, known as the VOC, was only too happy to help. They arrived with better ships, better guns, and better accountants, which is how you know this will end badly. They kicked the Portuguese out, and then in a twist that everyone saw coming except the king, they didn't leave. They presented a bill for their military services that the king couldn't possibly pay, so they took the land instead. The Sri Lankans had swapped a gang of thugs for a corporation. And as history teaches us, there's nothing more terrifying than an official with a musket. The VOC turned the spice trade into a program of violence with paperwork. Under Dutch law, the penalty for selling cinnamon to anyone other than the company was death. The penalty for damaging a cinnamon tree was, you've guessed it, also death. They locked down the island and forced the peelers to work for virtually nothing. They were trapped in a cycle of debt and slavery that makes modern forced labor look like a holiday camp. But the Dutch weren't just cruel. By the 18th century, the VOC had become so efficient at squeezing the island that they actually had too much cinnamon. The warehouses in Amsterdam were overflowing. Now, basic economics suggests that when supply goes up, the price comes down. This would have been great for the consumer, meaning cheaper apple pies for everyone. The VOC, however, preferred a different approach. In 1760, in a history-repeating act that would have made Emperor Nero proud, the company burned millions of guilders worth of cinnamon in Amsterdam. They set fire to their own product to create scarcity. The fruits of the islanders' misery were destroyed just to ensure the price remained artificially high. The VOC believed this outrageous way to keep prices up was perfectly rational. But biology is stubborn. While the Dutch were busy staring at their profit margins, the monopoly was already leaking. A French missionary named Pierre Poivre, literally Peter Pepper, honestly I'm not making this up, was about to prove that you can't put a fence around a plant. Pierre Poivre was a one-armed French botanist with a name that sounds like a cartoon character. But he was serious about spices. He realized that the Dutch East India Company's power relied entirely on geography. If the trees could be grown elsewhere, the Dutch monopoly would collapse. So he smuggled cinnamon seedlings out of Dutch territory and planted them in the French colonies of the Seychelles and Réunion. The genie was out of the bottle. By the time the British arrived to kick the Dutch out of Sri Lanka in 1796, the game was already changing. Cinnamon began to grow in India, the Caribbean and South America. The price crashed. The gold became garnish. But there was one final insult waiting for the true cinnamon of Sri Lanka. As the price dropped and mass production ramped up, the world stopped caring about quality and started caring about efficiency. Enter Cinnamomum cassia, a cousin of true cinnamon that grows in China, Indonesia and Vietnam. While true Ceylon cinnamon is harvested in those delicate paper-thin layers, cassia is harvested by hacking off the entire thick, rough outer bark. True cinnamon is subtle, floral and crumbly. You can crush it in your hand. Cassia is dark, hard and pungent, and contains high levels of coumarin, a chemical that can damage your liver in high doses. It's so tough, it will break your coffee grinder if you try to crush it. It's rougher, harsher, and much, much cheaper. So the global market made its choice. If you go to a supermarket today in the US or Europe and buy a jar labeled cinnamon, there's a very high chance you're buying cassia. We spent 3,000 years inventing myths, fighting wars, enslaving populations, and burning cities to control the supply of true cinnamon. And when we finally got it, we decided we preferred the cheap knockoff because it tasted more Christmassy. So the next time you sprinkle that brown powder on your frothy coffee, spare a thought for the Cinnamologus monster bird. It was a lie. The real monster was us. Still, on the plus side, your cappuccino smells festive.